When people in the West think of Sufi poetry, the first name that comes to mind is Rumi. His verses, translated beautifully into English, have found their way into spiritual discussions, self-help books, and even social media captions. But while Rumi has become a household name, another profound Sufi philosopher remains largely unknown outside of South Asia, Bulleh Shah. This is not due to a lack of depth in his poetry or philosophy, but rather the barriers of language and historical neglect. Unlike Rumi, whose Persian works were translated extensively, Bulleh Shah's poetry, written in Punjabi, a language often overlooked in global literary discourse, has not received the same treatment. Yet, Bulleh Shah was not merely a poet. He was a rebel, a mystic, and a philosopher who stripped Sufism down to its essence, breaking away from religious orthodoxy and speaking directly to the soul. His poetry does not just celebrate divine love. It challenges power, condemns hypocrisy, and elevates human dignity above dogma. His words still resonate today, carrying wisdom that transcends time and culture. Bulleh Shah's rebellious mysticism. Unlike many classical Sufi poets who worked within the traditional Islamic framework, Bulleh Shah directly challenged religious institutions. He saw how religious leaders used faith as a means of control rather than enlightenment, and he was unafraid to call them out. His poetry is filled with biting critiques of those who preach righteousness while ignoring the corruption within themselves. You have read and become a scholar, but have failed to read your soul, have entered thousands of mosques and temples, yet your heart you never explored, have fought the devils fiercely, yet never fought your inner self. This verse highlights one of the core ideas of his philosophy, that true spirituality is not in rituals, but in self-awareness. A person may perform religious duties perfectly, but if they fail to examine their own soul, they have missed the entire point. This echoes the universal Sufi idea of self-purification, but Bulleh Shah expresses it in a raw, unapologetic way that makes it accessible to ordinary people. The self as the source of evil. Many religious traditions place the source of evil outside the self, blaming Satan, the world, or external influences. But Bulleh Shah's philosophy flips this idea on its head. He believed that the true enemy was within us, hidden in our egos, desires, and unchecked arrogance. I went in search of an evil man. I looked and looked but found none. But when I dared to look inside me, I found I am the only evil one. This is a profound realization, one that challenges the human tendency to blame others for the world's problems. Rather than pointing fingers at society or external enemies, Bulleh Shah teaches that true change begins within. This message, though centuries old, feels remarkably modern in an era where people often refuse to take personal responsibility for their actions. Detachment from materialism. Bulleh Shah's poetry is also deeply anti-materialistic. He saw worldly attachments, wealth, possessions, power, as illusions that lead to suffering. His verses emphasize the fleeting nature of life and warn against greed. Say not mine, nor mine to keep, for days of ecstasy, then the whole world is a dust heap. This echoes the wisdom found in many spiritual traditions, from Buddhism to Stoicism. But what makes Bulleh Shah unique is the simplicity and earthy realism of his words. He does not offer abstract metaphysics. He speaks in terms that a common farmer or a laborer could understand. His critique of human greed is further highlighted in this verse. Have you seen the flying birds? They do not hoard, nor do they starve. But only men hoard, and yet only men starve. Here, he questions the paradox of human suffering. Why do creatures of nature live in harmony, while humans, who hoard wealth, still suffer from poverty? This is a direct challenge to the social and economic injustices of his time, and it remains strikingly relevant today. Love beyond boundaries. One of Bulleh Shah's most controversial yet profound themes is his radical view of love. In his poetry, love is not just about God. It transcends religious labels and even human logic. One of his most striking verses expresses this idea. "Do not doubt my love. I have never wronged my sight. I have met you every single time. As for God was Moses' delight, nor have I neglected to worship you. I cared for no peril. I just couldn't call you God, or I would have done everything else." This verse is deeply mystical. Bulleh Shah suggests that his love is so absolute, so consuming, that it rivals religious devotion. But at the same time, he refuses to equate his beloved with God, maintaining a boundary that makes his devotion all the more sincere. This challenges traditional religious notions of worship and devotion, suggesting that true love, whether divine or human, demands total surrender, the ultimate rebellion, compassion over rituals. Perhaps Bulleh Shah's most famous verse is his radical declaration that compassion is greater than religious identity. Break the temples and mosques down. Break whatever. I don't care. Just don't break a human heart, for God resides there. This is the essence of his philosophy. He saw God not in places of worship, but in the human heart. This was a dangerous idea in his time, and even today, it remains a challenge to religious exclusivism. By placing human dignity above dogma, he became a true Sufi revolutionary. Why Bulleh Shah remains obscure? Despite his powerful message, Bulleh Shah remains largely unknown in the West. Unlike Rumi, who wrote in Persian, a language that had a long tradition of Western translation, Bulleh Shah wrote in Punjabi, a language that has not been given the same literary prestige. Many of his works have not been translated in a way that fully captures their raw, rebellious spirit. Additionally, his direct attack on religious authority made him a controversial figure, even among Sufi circles. While many classical Sufi poets worked within the existing Islamic framework, Bulleh Shah's unfiltered critique of orthodoxy made him a threat to religious elites. His poetry was even banned at times, and he was denied a proper burial by religious scholars of his era. Yet, his legacy lives on through oral tradition. In Punjab, his poetry is sung by folk musicians, keeping his words alive in the hearts of the people. His message of love, self-awareness, and rebellion against hypocrisy remains as relevant today as it was centuries ago. Conclusion: the Sufi philosopher the world overlooked, Bulleh Shah was more than just a poet. He was a philosopher, a mystic, and a revolutionary. His work challenges the rigid boundaries of religion, questions human greed, and urges us to look inward rather than outward for the source of evil. While the West celebrates Rumi as the ultimate Sufi poet, it has yet to truly discover Bulleh Shah, a thinker whose words are just as profound, if not more radical. For those willing to go beyond the limitations of language, his poetry offers a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the human soul. He speaks not in riddles, but in truths that shake us to our core. Perhaps it is time for the world to finally listen.